Next one, people obviously have read them, is why has regional economic convergence in the U.S. declined? I think Peter's done some great work, and I certainly wasn't involved in setting up the discussants here, but we have another great discussant working with Peter Christmeyer there. You know, maybe it'd be like a cage fight here or something, but they both have very strong economic backgrounds, and I know that wasn't by chance. So just want to compliment Peter on one thing. I kind of always start from the back. Some way it's easier to rifle back. I saw all these formulas in there. I go, oh boy, this is going to be fun. And but I loved your example for the rest of us in the real world, talking about migration in New York City, where lawyers, it's still a hotbed for lawyers, and lawyers can, forget the exact number, but maybe only pay 25% of their salary for housing. But then the janitors, who obviously work just as hard, they would be spending 50%. And I think that's what it's all about. People are saying, I can't migrate, at least that topic. I can't migrate from the north to the south because of the cost of housing. So I'm saying it very simplistic from a layman's point of view, but I know everyone's looking forward to seeing it from the author of the paper.
Thanks so much to Dan Bergstresser for encouraging me to apply, and to Bradley for the introduction. Bradley, I thought it was a little bit funny that you opened earlier by saying that I know everyone in the room has read the papers, because I've never been to an academic conference where everyone's read the papers. But maybe this is a different crowd. Stepping back for a second, the next 15 minutes are actually going to be almost not at all about muni finance. So you can take off, if you want, your professional cap and hopefully just sort of put on your curiosity about the world and long-term regional trends. So the title of our paper, and the question that we hope to answer, is why has regional income convergence declined in the US? Why has regional income convergence declined in the US? So the graph on the left here looks from 1940 to 1960. What was a state's income in 1940? And what happened between 1940 and 1960? And so you can probably, with your eyes closed, actually rank these states. So the poor states in 1940, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Kentucky, those are states that grew very quickly from 1940 to 1960. They were growing at about 1.75 percentage points a year. The richest states, most of them, you could also name with your eyes closed: Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Those states actually, we think of them as rich and prosperous. They actually grew very slowly from 1940 to 1960. In recent years, and so this relationship is called convergence. And this plot where you see that poor states grow quickly and rich states grow slowly is one of the cleanest plots you'll ever see in regional macroeconomics. We almost never have a variable that does this good of a job of predicting what's going to happen over the next 20 years. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it doesn't predict nearly as much anymore. So today, or from 1990 to 2010, poor states and rich states are growing at relatively similar rates. And so that's the question we set out to answer, is why? Why might it be in the past that poor states grow quickly, rich states don't? And that's not the case anymore. And so I'm going to show you another fact that for us is very informative in trying to think about answering our question. So, one more plot first. The red dot is what I showed you with the red line there. The purple dot is the purple line. And if you take any 20-year window, looking in the mid-century, you'll find that poor states are catching up to rich states. For pretty much any 20-year window, looking over more recent decades, you'll find that poor states are no longer catching up to rich states. So now I'll show you population. The same x-axis as before, who's rich and who's poor. From 1940 to 1960, people are moving from poor states to rich states. So the fastest growing states are Delaware, Maryland, Connecticut, New Jersey, California. This is not, and people are leaving places like Mississippi. This is not at all the case today. So today, rich states, if you look in that bottom right quadrant, have some of the lowest growth rates in terms of population. And I can show you this for any 20-year window. And there's a period in US history where poor states are catching up to rich states, and people are moving from poor states to rich states. And there's a period in US history recently where both of those things have come to a stop. And so I want to tell you a little bit about our theory for why has this come to a stop. Are the rules of economics not holding, that suddenly people don't move from poor places to rich places, or is there something else that can explain what's going on? So I'm going to start by giving you 3 new facts about housing prices, and then I'm going to think in a little bit more of a statistical fashion using regressions about the role of housing regulations in determining some of those facts. So here are my 3 facts. The first has to do with housing prices. So I'm going to have the same x-axis as I showed you before, log income. In 1960, rich places had more expensive housing prices than poor places, but not by very much. It was about 1% increase in housing price is a 1% increase in income is a 1% increase in housing price. Today, that relationship is twice as strong. Where incomes are 1% higher, housing prices are 2% higher. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that this change in housing prices has changed the value of migration, which Bradley alluded to before, talking about the example of a lawyer and a janitor thinking about living in the Deep South versus living in New York City. So it used to be that if you moved from a poor state to a rich state, to a state that was $1 richer, that your income, even after taking into account housing costs, would rise by about $1, maybe 80 cents. You can see these numbers on the left-hand side from 1940 to 1980. But since 1980, there's been a divergence where if you move to a rich state and you do not have a college education, even if average incomes in that state are substantially higher, you're not going to capture many of those gains because wages aren't going to be as high and housing prices are going to be much, much higher. And so there's been a change in the returns to migration, and that then affects where people move. So this is the most messy plot of the entire talk, and so I'm going to try to go through and explain carefully what we did. So we took data from 500 different small regions, basically groups of counties, and we asked, where are people moving for each of these 500 groups of counties? Now, if I were to put up 500 dots, the plot would be a huge mess. And so I'm collapsing the data down into 20 dots and then showing you a regression line. And so in the top right, you can see that if you rank these county groups by their income, people are, in general, moving out of poor county groups and rich county groups among people with BAs. Now, on the left-hand panel, you can see the same x-axis variable, what's the income in different places, and where are people moving for people who don't have a college education. And so you can see that people are actually moving away from wealthy places who do not have a college education. And this seems like a really big puzzle, at least if you're just looking at incomes. Once you take into account incomes and housing prices, it looks pretty different. So in the bottom panel, rather than looking at nominal income for everyone in the state, we look at the income for your skill group and the housing costs for your skill group. And low-skill workers are moving to the places that are beneficial for them. High-skill workers are moving to the places that are beneficial for them. But those are two distinct set of places now. The places that offer good jobs to low-skill workers are no longer the places that offer good jobs to high-skill workers. And so hopefully by now you're wondering why. What has happened? What has changed in America such that we've gone from a world where people were moving from poor places to rich places and poor places were catching up to the world that we seem to have been living in for the last 30 years? And so we spent a lot of time looking around, thinking about different hypotheses, and the one which ended up being the best fit for the data and the one that we spent the most time on had to do with housing regulations. And so we came up with a new measure of how hard is it to build in each state. And the way we did this is we took a legal database and we searched in each year, in each state, how many cases are there about land use? And why are we searching legal databases? The idea is that there are lots and lots of different ways that a community can restrict new construction. But no matter how they do it, there's probably going to be some lawsuits at some point down the road. And so by counting lawsuits related to land use is a way to capture lots of different methods that municipalities will use for restricting their new construction. So this new measure, we can see it evolve over time. So until now, we've only had measures of in 1 year what were housing regulations. And the advantage of this one is we can see it evolve over time. And it predicts what happens to housing prices, which shouldn't be surprising, but is important for making sense of what's going on. It also goes up a lot. So this is the number of land use cases per million people. And if you take other kinds of cases, you don't see this kind of increase in the database. There specifically are a lot more fights now about land use and a lot more lawsuits now about land use than there used to be between, say, 1940 and 1970. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a variable that tries to capture the idea of, does a state have a lot of land use restrictions right now? And we want it to make it simple. We want to just have a variable that's either turned on or turned off. We're going to ask, do you have more land use cases than the median in any given year in any given state? And so we're going to sort of divide the world into two. But the thing that's a little bit different about this from your typical regression is that states can switch. Because at the beginning, all the states are low land use regulation. And by the end, maybe 60% of the states or so have high land use regulation. And so we're going to do that, and we're going to look at 4 different outcomes. So first, the first column in this regression table shows you that when there's a 1% increase in a state's income, in a baseline world, just look at the first row, there's about a 0.8% increase in housing prices. Now, if you look down to the second row, you ask, how does this relationship change when regulations are high, land use regulations? And the answer is it becomes about twice as strong. Differences in income show up in housing prices about twice as much when you're in a world when there's a lot of land use regulation. Next, population. At baseline, there's a positive correlation. People move from poor states to rich states. I already showed you that sort of in a graphical way before. Except when you're in the high regulation world, that is to say in the set of states where regulations on land use are strong, you don't see people moving anymore en masse from poor states to rich states. There's a related factor that has to do with skills. It used to be, if you think about things, historical moments like the Great Migration from the South, that not just lots of people were moving from the South to the North, but lots of low-skill workers were moving from the South to the North in search of economic opportunity. And what that meant was that the South was low skill, the North was high skill, and the South was catching up to the North as people moved from the South to the North. And so human capital levels or skill levels across the US used to be converging. That's what you see on top. And then this is also a pattern which has disappeared. That is to say, the places that used to offer opportunity to low-skill workers don't offer that kind of opportunity anymore, and so they're not moving. And so finally, hopefully the first 3 rows give you a hint to the columns, give you a hint to the last column, which is what we started at to answer in this paper, which is that at baseline, poor states are catching up to rich states. But when you enter a world, either a year or a state, when regulations are high, that relationship has mostly disappeared. So the world of high land use regulations is a world, or let me start it the other way. In the world where there aren't strong land use regulations, people move from poor to rich places, that's column 2. Human capital levels converge, that's column 3. And incomes converge, that's column 4. In the world where there are high land use restrictions, prices are much higher in productive places. People stop moving on net to those places, and the people who do keep moving there are people who have college educations, and income convergence stops as well. I think I'm going to skip this slide. This is a little bit technical. It just says that you don't need to use today's level of regulations. You can use historic measures of regulations from 1965, and even historic measures of land use regulation show up as being particularly important in recent years. So to conclude, we've seen 2 patterns that have both come almost to a stop in the last 30 years. Used to be that people were moving from poor to rich places. It used to be that poor and rich places had incomes that were converging. And the what I hope you'll learn from our paper is that we think these two things are linked. And we think in particular that migration is the mechanism which drove regional convergence. And so it used to be you have people moving en masse from one place to another. Now instead you have what we call skill sorting with a swap. Every time that a high-skill worker moves to DC, two things happen. Housing prices go up, and a low-skill worker is pushed out. And that's true in DC, it's true in San Francisco, it's true in Boston, it's true in New York. And some of the best evidence for this is that if you look around the country at places that don't have housing supply restrictions, those places are still converging, just like the old historical relationship. It's only the places with high regulations and high incomes that have caused this relationship to break. And John asked at the end of the last session, what am I supposed to do with this information? I don't have a great answer for you, but I think you should worry about it a lot. I'll end on that note.
He's all yours. Pretty interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm Chris Meyer. I want to thank Brad for spearheading our group. I want to thank Peter for doing a great paper. Very interesting work. I think very sophisticated work. There's a lot to commend about it. In my extensive notes to myself, I noted that, well, first of all, there will be no cage fight, so relax, despite what the prediction was. However, I have taken a couple cues from John Hallisey's bag of tricks, so he inspired me to write some things down. I want to apologize for being a gum chewer. I became aware of this as the board member of a board, and one of our executive directors was severely chastised for chewing gum in public. I can't help it. I'll grind to a halt if I don't chew gum. I've got a moisture problem. In any case, let me get to the meat of the topic here. Analysts love the fact that you have data and trivia in here, good trivia. I don't mean that pejoratively. And they love good charts, and you have good charts that have excellent economic significance. So I congratulate you on that. That's the way to get through to the practitioner is a picture's worth 1,000 words, or a chart. So I think that was very well done. I think Mr. Hallisey noted that one of the questions was, is conventional wisdom being challenged? And I'm going to leave that as an open question for the people in the audience. I don't think perhaps as much as it could be. I mean, this is the municipal market, and municipal practitioners are highly aware of government intervention in housing markets via the fact that we have single-family mortgage bonds at the state level. We're aware of the fact that states offer tax credits to developers to produce housing, multifamily housing. We are also, the tax code itself, and the fact that mortgages are deductible, et cetera. So we're acquainted, at least in a practitioner's way, with the significant extent of federal, state, and local government involvement in markets. At the local level, in particular, as far as zoning goes, that's an issue for us. We run into the NIMBY problem with relative frequency, especially if you invest in solid waste disposal bonds. So there is an area there, but that notwithstanding, I think there's some excellent material here, and it's a great paper. I think one thing, going through this is sort of the elephant in the room is the Texas-California debate. You really, in a sense, without perhaps intending to, have highlighted the debate that goes on between two relatively fast-growing states, California and Texas, and the vastly different housing markets that they have, and the vastly different migration experience that they have. And so your paper gets to kind of an element of this debate in a way that I think is interesting. I'm going to add, just kind of on the side, that there's been a Trulia study that maybe you're familiar with. It's not that new, but it maps the spread of California housing versus Texas housing, and finds that as that spread grows, you get more migration from California to Texas. Now, that's not surprising, But the migration does not come from lower skilled individuals, it comes from higher skilled individuals. So the wealthier people move from California to Texas. I don't have an opinion about the quality of the study. Maybe they're wrong, I don't know. But anyway, moving along, I have a couple thoughts about the paper and recommendations. The modeling, I think, has a great intuitive logic, especially if you're not somebody who understands a ton about modeling, which would include me. I think the conclusions are readily acceptable to all municipal finance professionals, economists, business people, muni practitioners. The thought that housing regulations would impede the efficiency of the market and would impede the movement of labor in some way, shape, or form is a pretty straightforward conclusion. I think that you incorporate some good history, which I think gives context, but on the other hand, a lot of that history is really almost medieval in terms of its time sequencing. In 1980, you didn't have the automobile invented yet, and automobiles create Benz in 1986. I looked it up, according to Wikipedia anyway. And you didn't have, people rode horses. And so the mobility of labor is going to be less. And I realize you're not focusing on 1880, excuse me. I said 1980. Sorry, 1880. But you incorporate a large quantity of time here just in terms of at least the discussion and the creation, the building of the argument that relates to an era in this country where things were just so vastly different, they're non-comparable. Most economists will not use any macro data on business cycles before World War II for the simple reason that the Great Depression bears no relevance to any environments in the U.S. since World War II. So I think you're in a similar situation. I would almost encourage you to ignore even the discussion of any pre-World War II information here, even if it's just sort of a lead-up. Then moving along, I think that there's been a ton of criticism of modeling, and economists have become immune to this, so there's no point in me trying to heap it along. But I do think that one of the issues in modeling is that you have a real hard time of, I think, demonstrating that you, in fact, have controlled for all variables, which is something that John had mentioned. And I think also there's the basic problem, and this was studied by this guy named Carter, who maybe many of you are familiar with. He's not an economist. He's a geophysicist. But the basic problem is once you can structure a model based on forces of gravity, and once you calibrate the model and start to project or forecast, you run into problems, even with a much higher degree of certainty as to the physical relationships than you'd ever get in economics. So the calibration issue and so many other factors of modeling are questionable. Let's talk about, how am I doing? I've got a clock here somewhere, right? 2 minutes and 53 seconds. Okay, I gotta get it rolling. Labor mobility, first of all, if you go into the US Census, this is kind of an interesting dynamic between the modeling economist and the empiricist. If you just go to the US Census, they tell you exactly how many people moved and where they moved and why they moved. And from 2014 to 15, which I realize doesn't give any historical perspective, changes in marital status, establish your own household, for other family reasons, to be closer to an existing job, for retirement. Now you get to due to a job change or transfer, due to work or job lost. To look for a house has to stop renting. So the behavior is not, as implied by the model, motivated by a desire to maximize after housing costs or pickup in income. But if you look at the empirical data, there's a whole host of reasons that motivate migration. And while housing and distortions created by government are certainly relevant, to me, it's not a necessary requirement you cover everything, but on the other hand, you may want to mention some of these things. So I also think it's important to value the housing cost based on a net basis because, as I mentioned previously, the government subsidizes the housing market extensively. So there's a net cost of housing. Yeah, you got zoning, you got restrictions. Incidentally, New York City got the ball rolling in 1860, I get the century right here, with restrictions on commercial activities in Brooklyn. So zoning goes back a long ways. But the fact is, you've got a lot of add-backs to the cost. Now, I wouldn't have a clue as to magnitudes, but they should be at least discussed. I think also that I'm going to raise a quasi-technical point of which I'm probably making a mistake in doing this, but there's an assumption of non-homothetic preferences, meaning that as incomes rise, people will demand less housing. Now, Nicolas Cage has proven that wrong single-handedly. You can be very wealthy and demand a lot of housing. And while I'm trying to be amusing, the fact is, I think it's a disputable point, and it's done to facilitate the modeling and to help promote the conclusion. And I think it's debatable whether housing preferences are homothetic or non-homothetic, or whether housing is an inferior good. We know lots of wealthy people that buy bigger and bigger and bigger houses, and they never stop. Just ask any rock star you want to ask. Now I'm down to 0 seconds. Can I buy 30 seconds and a vowel or a consonant? Let me see. Let me conclude with even since 1980, your time period corresponds to a period when productivity was changing rapidly, and it doesn't match perfectly, but there are potential productivity issues across the entire economy that you may want to look at, in my opinion. The second thing is, what about the growth of income inequality over this time period? I mean, this is a significant factor, and yet there's no mention of that, and that could explain why low-skilled people do not have the capacity to afford housing. In other words, maybe it isn't housing's problem or regulation of housing. Maybe it's the bigger and bigger and bigger gap between high-skilled and low-skilled. Okay, thank you so much. Excellent paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope I did it justice in my comments. Thank you.
Peter, thank you, and Chris, thank you. I'm sure we're going to have some questions, and someone is really way in the back. We're going to use you, sir.
Thank you. So I just have a couple questions related to the land use restriction tie-in, and one sort of picks up on a point that Chris was just making about. I'm just curious to know how you came upon the land use restriction tie-in. It seems, as Chris mentioned, that there are a lot of other factors that could explain some of the things you're talking about, taxation or other types of regulation, et cetera. So I'm just curious to know how you picked up on and chose to focus on the land use restriction tie-in in particular. And then secondly, on that issue, I'm curious to know why or how you chose to look at legal cases relating to land use as a reliable indicator of the level of restriction in a particular jurisdiction. It seems that, again, there are other factors that could explain why there are more legal cases in a high-income area, for instance, because there's a cost barrier to litigation, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if you controlled for those other types of factors.
Great questions. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So, but I think if I move my chin down, it doesn't work. Here, let me move this up a little bit. How about now? Okay. So, why land use? So I think that also Chris asked a question, which is this novel? Didn't we know this already? So the reigning narrative in economics of what's happening in regions in the US, when we wrote this paper, I think it's changing a little bit now, was about skill-biased technological change. There's just some places that are wonderfully productive. They've gotten this manna known as startups, and those are the places if you want to understand why there are opportunity differences in America, you just have to think about technology and technological advances. And so we thought about it and realized that that couldn't be the whole story, because then everyone should be moving, then we should be seeing skyscrapers in Palo Alto, which we're not seeing. So that, and combined with basically personal experience of living in Boston, where we both live, played a big role in why we started to focus on land use at baseline. A second question you asked was about why bother with cases? Like, is this going to be reliable? Aren't there other things that could determine cases? So there's two things that I want to point out here. So the first is that we really wanted a historical measure. So other economists have gone out and done surveys today in great detail of what are existing land use regulations today, but we really wanted an ability to go back in time. And so if you need to come up with a way to go back in time, you're going to be constrained by what is there in sort of existing historical records. You raised a specific concern, which is, what if some places are richer? So the regressions that I showed you before were not, what is the effect of regulations? It is, how does the effect of regulations differ in a rich place than in a poor place? So in other words, it was sort of controlling for income and asking, how do regulations act differently in rich places and poor places?
This question right here.
Hello, Sudhir Bagchi, Villanova University. So two questions, one of which has to do with property taxes. So when I think about the cost of housing, then from the standpoint of a property owner, it's not just how much I paid for the house or sort of the sale price of the house, it's also a sort of an all-inclusive price when I think about property taxes. In many cases, that can be a very significant proportion of the sale price itself. The other question is about zoning. So essentially, when I think about land use regulations, I mostly think of it as a local issue where zoning boards, they are the ones who are making decisions, whereas I'm not completely clear whether this measure is a state-level measure. And so one question, one sort of a comment which I had is that could be distinguished within a state based on some localities which have particularly onerous land use regulations and others which do not. For example, I keep hearing about Austin, for example, and then how does that differ from Houston and other places which don't? Again, with California, I suspect San Francisco may look very different from Bakersfield or someplace inland. So can we do anything along those lines?
Let me offer something real basic, and then you can offer the heavy stuff. I know the only thing I know about urban economics is from Thibault, who is the starting point, and I think you're asking, at least at the origin, a Thibault-related question, which relates to sorting and people making selections, and in essence viewing this process from the vantage point of the person who's choosing where to live and making a choice. And they have the choice A of a certain level of property taxes, a certain level of services, and certain zoning requirements that they'll have to live with. And they have choice B, which might have a different basket of evils, property tax level, zoning, et cetera. So I think that's one aspect that is important, in terms of you pursuing, your study into this, because it does influence, where people are going, where people are migrating. If you look at the U.S. Census data, almost everybody goes within the same county year to year to year. So I think it's important to have that sense of context when we talk about migration, because a muni analyst, a practitioner, tends to think that there's just it's like the Sooners. Everybody's lined up on the border of California, ready to head west to Texas at any particular moment.
Great. So one sort of piece of, I guess, technical explanation, and then I'll answer your two questions. So this came up in your discussion. There's a distinction between gross migration and net migration. So gross migration is the US Census calls you up and says, did you move last year? And some percent of people are going to say yes. And as you noted, most of those people didn't move very far. And on top of that, most of those people are swapping places. So for example, if 2% of, take two equally sized states, I can't say California and Texas, but let's pretend Texas and Florida, right? If 2% of people move from Texas to Florida and Florida to Texas, we would say that there's gross migration, but we'd say net migration is 0. And so the key variable when the census is calling people is gross migration, and all those reasons you listed of divorce and buying a house and starting a job are all gross migration, whereas if we're thinking about what determines regional trends, we're often interested in net migration. How many people, when you add it up and subtract, moved in or out of a place? Sure. Property taxes, the short answer is that we did take them into account when looking at costs, and I agree they're significant. I would love to have a local-based zoning measure. Ed Glazer has put this together for municipalities in Massachusetts. I don't know of any nationwide historical local measure, but I think about like 1,000 cities and towns responded to the Warden survey. So yeah, I think it would be great to look at local. We were just limited by the data we had.
Right here in front.
Okay, so a couple of things. I think in terms of the gross versus net migration, there have been some studies that show the reason for the move is also related to those factors. So distance migration tends to be more job related, whereas local migration tends to be for life changes like marriage or divorce or whatever. You might stay within the same county, and there's a whole bunch of literature on that. But the other thing I wanted, this is just a thought that popped in my head about when you say someone leaves and someone comes, and the reasons are different, and the skill set and the education level is different. Last week's job report, what sort of resonated with me was the discussion about how college-educated young people are taking jobs at perhaps a lower level than the job might require, and perhaps displacing lower skilled, lower educated individuals. That was a macro view, and I don't know how that might tie into your thesis if you looked at the regional composition. So in the richer places, maybe the millennials or the children of the folks that are in higher paid, higher wealth positions are taking the job in the bar, in the coffee house, in the healthcare field, which are easier entry, lower skilled, versus moving to Iowa, Mississippi, Alabama, wherever, pick, you know. So it's just a thought. I'm a little stream of consciousness here on that, but I think it's kind of an interesting connection to what you said.
So my co-author on this paper, Dan Shoag, has a paper about upskilling and downskilling in the wake of the recession, and when do jobs seem to list sort of excessive education requirements, particularly because they can hire those people. So Danny has a paper about exactly that issue.
Right here in front.
Interesting. And I was wondering if you took into account multifamily versus residential complexities in the study. I think that's really critical, especially as it relates to poor people generally live in rental units and the opposite. And also, as they mentioned, the siting of rental units in various high-cost neighborhoods is always much more difficult. And as a policymaker, I mean, there's been the role of the GSEs and other federal tax subsidies in the residential markets, sort of in surplus to the rental markets. And I was wondering if you sort of took into account federal tax policies and other subsidy policies to address that.
Can you say a little more just about, you said, did you take into account single versus multifamily? Can you tell me a little more, like how did that, help me think about that issue in this context?
Well, I mean, if you look at housing starts and availability of supply over the, at least, you know, running up to the boom, that was heavily skewed towards the residential market. I always blame the development of the air conditioner for that, which allows Florida, California, Texas, and those kind of markets to develop in a lot of land and very cheap. But just in general, the development, the shift in policy has been, you know, since the early Bush administration and the Clinton administration to develop residential real estate. That's where Fannie and Freddie put their resources. It's where Ginnie Mae put their resources. And there was a limited amount of federal subsidy for rental units relative to low-income housing tax credits, a very finite, small federal subsidy. So I think our policy, and of course the mortgage deduction. So policy has been to increase home ownership society, as the Bush administration called it. And clearly 2008 brought a change to that, and and the home ownership rates have fallen.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the answer is no, we didn't take that into account in any specific way, not for a lack of interest. Like, it's hard to come up with a good variable which from 1940 to today will track that set of policies. But I think where you're absolutely right is that if you have a set of policies that promote detached single-family structures, it's going to be difficult to build for density. It's going to be difficult for local institutions to build for density when all of the federal institutions are pushing you towards low density, and then you're not going to be able to produce as much supply as maybe the market would like to see. So I think I completely agree that that's an important force in terms of understanding why do we not have the houses that people would like to pay for.
Well, thank you. And maybe I'll kind of expose myself, make sure I understood some of your excellent scattergrams, which certainly Chris commented on in terms of educating people who have not been totally immersed in this. The first one shows that there was like a leveling of income over time in the various states. Is that true?
They were getting closer to each other.
Closer together. And the next one shows that there's less leveling of closeness. Is that true?
That's right. They're not, inequality persists. It's no longer shrinking.
Right. So does this mean if you're a poor state, you should be depressed because you're going to be a poor state for a long time?
Yes.
That's kind of depressing.
I said you should worry.
Well, you didn't say why, and you made the 100 people in the room here think why we have to worry, but that is the conclusion, isn't it? If you're a governor of a poor state, Chris, I welcome your comments. Yeah.
I'm an optimist, but I think there's
Me too. That's what I was wondering.
there's certain general social economic trends over long periods of time, and many of these trends will improve and subject to diminishing marginal returns. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think certainly there's no question that housing regulations had an impact and other things may have had an impact, but the rate of improvement in convergence, and there's a lot of literature, as you well know, on the international side. Jeff Sachs and 1,000 other guys have written about convergence on a sovereign basis. And there's only so much improvement you're going to get before the rate of improvement starts to slow as things start to equalize. Now, they won't equalize perfectly, and they may widen up again, and we've seen some of that. But I think some of this is, if you take a long enough perspective, you're going to find just what you found, which is things for a long time, 80 years, got better, as transportation facilitated people from moving from Mississippi to New York, and as the wage compensation started to we started to compete a national labor market instead of a totally localized labor market, those kinds of things. So.
Okay. Oh, look at that, perfectly zero. But thank you very much, and I want to introduce our next speaker.
Well done. Thank you very much.